everybody. Welcome to see you, and thanks so much for logging on and joining this call on a nice sunny day. Thanks for coming on to Zoom. So tonight's just going to be a little bit different. We have Gareth Black here, who you might know from Missions Week, but if you don't, I'm just going to ask Gareth to introduce himself. Gareth, if you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and maybe I was trying to think of something fun that maybe would like be Easter themed. So if you want to tell us, what if you could get any Easter egg chocolate that you or any Easter egg, what Easter egg would you pick? It's probably a rubbish question, but
It's a good question. I'm never ready for these kinds of questions when they
sorry.
come, even though people like ask me them all the time when I'm on these calls. I'm a bit of a galaxy man, so I quite like galaxy chocolate. Oh, I've already turned half the audience against me. So possibly like a galaxy caramel. I don't actually know if they exist. I got my first Easter egg yesterday, which was a Mars bar one.
Oh,
So
that's
I'll take that. But yeah, if I could choose, probably something galaxy related,
that's a good choice. I
as
agree
controversial
there.
as it is.
And do you want to just tell us, Gareth, what you do?
Yeah, sure. I do basically two things. For those of you who don't know me or maybe weren't at Missions Week, grew up in Northern Ireland, grew up in Jordanstown, now living in Ballyclare with my wife Amy. I do two things basically with my working week. So the first half of my week, I work with an organization called Solus, which is an organization that engages in sort of evangelism and evangelism training, sharing the good news of Jesus, mostly with people who don't agree with it, have loads of questions and skepticism about it. Just love engaging with those kind of people. And then the second half of my week, I'm doing a PhD in ethics, end of life ethics. So yeah, that's how I divide up my week.
Busy guy. Thanks so much for coming on and joining us tonight. So, how this is going to work is I'm just going to hand over to Gareth now, but I'm going to put in the Slido, that should work now, the Slido code. So if that doesn't work, the code is just human. So if you have any questions throughout the night, then you can just go on the Slido, type in human, and you can ask questions anonymously there. So then we can give those to Gareth at the end. So I'm just going to mute myself now and hand over to Gareth, if that's okay.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so I really would just want to thank you guys for the opportunity to be back with you. I had a brilliant time doing the Missions Week in November. Seems like so long ago, and seems like probably the last in-person event that I was at, which is crazy that it was 4.5 months ago. But that's where we are. We basically got a few live events and then everything locked down. But it's good to be with you guys via Zoom tonight. As Kate has said, really tonight the best part of tonight and the most important part of tonight is really the Q&A. So I would really encourage you guys just to be asking questions. If there are any questions around this topic of did Jesus really rise from the dead that just initially intuitively hit you, then please just write them down and stick them into Slido. If there's other stuff that might ignite a question as I speak for a few minutes, then please do write that down. I'm just going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and it's really just an appetizer. It's really just to whet the palate and really get the questions going. So this is not going to be like an extensive talk, and there's loads that I won't be able to cover. But I do just want to raise a few things that will hopefully just generate ideas and questions and pushback and criticism, and that's all fine. Please do feel absolutely free to bring those, and you can do it either with identifying yourself or anonymously. Either's absolutely fine. But one of the things that really stands out for me as somebody who's sort of explored different religions and studied religion comparatively, one of the things that really stands out for me is the fact that Christianity is a religion that's rooted in history. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Not all worldviews, not all philosophies, not all religions are rooted in history. And that becomes a problem. Um, it becomes a problem because um, trying to find out whether the claims of that religion are true or not true becomes very different if you have a religion like, say, Hinduism or something like that, which claims to not really exist in reality. And in Hinduism, there are multiple layers of reality. This is probably the lowest. The one that we exist in is kind of the lowest dimension of reality. But for a religion like Hinduism, it's almost impossible for us to be able to investigate whether it's true or whether it's not, because the majority of it doesn't exist in our reality. So, how could we ever know? How could we ever have the tools? How could we ever investigate as people kind of locked in to human history as we inherently all are? How could we ever truly know whether something outside that human history exists, unless whatever's outside that history claims to have broken into human history? And that's the claim about Christianity, that God does exist beyond our human history, but he has entered into human history. And a big part of that is obviously the life and the death, and what we're looking at today, the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus, we're all familiar with it from Easter, and some of us who've grown up in church will really be familiar with this idea of Jesus died and 3 days later he rose again. But when it comes to the heart of Christianity, you can't get more foundational than the resurrection. In fact, by Christianity's own admission, if the resurrection is not true, the whole thing falls apart. So if you want to disprove Christianity, Christianity itself gives you one way that you can do it completely. Walk away from the whole thing, discredit the whole thing, and that is to discredit the resurrection. Jesus was once asked by a group of Pharisees to show them a sign, to prove that he was who he claimed to be, the Son of God. And he said, look, this generation won't get a sign except one. The one sign, the one major piece of evidence that Jesus said his generation would get would be what he calls the sign of the prophet Jonah, where Jonah, you know the story of Jonah, where he was swallowed by a great fish for 3 days and was 3 days in the heart of this beast, and then in a sense resurrected 3 days later. And that was kind of speaking symbolically of death and resurrection. Jesus said that's the sign that will be given. In other words, Christianity stands or falls by whether Jesus's resurrection is true. One of the most significant propagators and Christians that human history has ever known is the Apostle Paul. And he said this in one of the earliest letters that we have in the New Testament, the letter of First Corinthians. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then all this message that we're sharing is useless and our faith is in vain. He said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith, everything that you've come to believe in, is futile and you're still in your sins. He said, if we have hope only in this life, then we're all people to be most pitied. We've bought into completely the wrong idea and backed the horse. So the test of whether Christianity is ultimately true or false hinges on whether Jesus did actually rise from the dead. And the question that I just want to explore for a few minutes is how could we know whether Jesus did or not? Because at the end of the day, millions of people do believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They're going to celebrate it this weekend. And in fact, it's probably true to say that the only reason why Christianity exists today, 20 centuries after it got started in a small part, an insignificant part of the Middle East, is because millions of people over those centuries have become convinced that Jesus was crucified, but also, more importantly, that he literally, physically rose from the dead. And if that's true, then it means he was who he claimed to be. But if it's not true, then the reality is that whatever else Jesus said and did, however inspirational, however nice and pleasant and significant that is, Jesus is nothing other than just another influential, maybe admirable figure in history, but ultimately a tragic figure. And that's one of the points that C.S. Lewis makes in his famous book, Mere Christianity. He says, look, when you really look at Christianity clearly, when you look at the claims, you can't say and you can't accept that that say something like, "Well, I think Jesus was a good moral teacher, but I don't think that he was the Son of God." Lewis says this. He says, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus, that I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be Son of God." Lewis says that's the one thing we must not say. He says, a man who was merely a man and yet said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. Lewis says, you must make your choice. He says, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord. But let's not come to this patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. Lewis says Jesus does not leave that option open to us, and he didn't intend to. So if that's what's at stake, how could we possibly know either way whether Jesus did rise from the dead or didn't? Because none of us obviously were physically around to see it. It happened 2,000 years ago. Is there any way that we could either prove it or disprove it? Now, proof in the strict sense only really exists in the realm of pure mathematics. So, more often when it comes to understanding and trusting what's actually going on in things that we can't physically see, philosophers and historians refer to what's often called the inference to the best explanation. In other words, you may not have seen for certain what happened at any given moment because you weren't there. But that doesn't mean that we can't come to some certain, even really certain conclusions about things that happen, because we can know certain things, we can have certain pieces of evidence around those events, and then we piece that evidence together and come up with what explanation or hypothesis makes the most sense of the facts and the information that we do have. This is the way crime scene investigators or detectives or the criminal justice system works every day. Imagine you're part of a CSI team and you arrive at what is obviously a crime scene, and someone has clearly been shot and murdered. Now, none of us, when you get there, would know exactly what has happened. We weren't there to physically see it happen, so we don't know who was involved and who the criminal was. But you can piece together the various bits of evidence and facts that are available to you in order to come up to a theory of a best explanation for what actually happened. So, what we would do in that case would be establish the various pieces of evidence that we can find. So, establish the time of death, establish maybe that this person was killed with a shotgun shell, maybe there was forced entry into the apartment where the crime took place, maybe there are items missing, and then you would speak to eyewitnesses, you would get forensic evidence, you would check out CCTV, you would look at circumstantial evidence, you would look at things like motive. And maybe we would identify a suspect off the back of that, and we would talk to that suspect and establish that they didn't have a credible alibi, and that their account of where they were and what was going on is inconsistent with where they actually were at the time of death, because we've seen on CCTV that that person was in the area, and around the time of death was seen fleeing the area. Forensic evidence maybe shows that they were in the apartment and maybe even have gunshot residue on an item of clothing. And maybe as we dig a little further, we establish that there was strong motives that this suspect had for killing the victim. And we piece all these individual bits together, even though we didn't physically see this person shoot the victim. We can piece all of these bits together in order to come up with a really strong explanation that shows that this suspect is guilty. I think it's exactly the same with the resurrection. None of us were there 2,000 years ago, but we can identify certain established facts, pieces of evidence that are certain, that historians and scholars of all kinds of different persuasions, not just Christian scholars, but Muslim scholars or atheist scholars, or scholars who are agnostic about the whole thing, certain pieces of evidence, certain facts that they all take seriously, that we can hold up and then say, okay, what explanation around the events of Jesus' death and his claimed resurrection makes the best sense of what actually happened. And that's what I want to do just for the last few minutes, is just give you four pieces of historically verified evidence, four facts around Jesus' death and resurrection that all historians, or the vast majority of historians, take really seriously. And the first one is that Jesus actually died at the hands of the Jewish and the Roman authorities. There is no record in all of ancient literature, in all of antiquity, of anyone ever surviving a full crucifixion. And remember that Jesus wasn't just crucified, he was also tortured, and was beaten in a really, really horrendous way before he actually even got to the cross. Beyond even the Bible itself and the biblical accounts, there's also extra biblical accounts from ancient historians like Josephus or Tacitus or Lucretius, who all purport that there was a man from Nazareth who was crucified by the religious rulers, or on behalf of the religious rulers by the Romans. His name was Jesus, and that he did actually die. It's almost without question that Jesus did die by crucifixion in the early first century in ancient Palestine. The second piece of evidence is the discovery of the empty tomb. The discovery of Jesus's tomb, the discovery that Jesus's tomb was both empty and open, is recorded in no less than 6 independent sources in the New Testament. And many of these documents are among the earliest documents that we have. Now, you might just say, well, what's significant about that? Well, if you're a historian, you take that really seriously, because it's significant for historians, because the earlier these documents can be to the events that they actually purport to talk about, the more confidence that a historian would have that there would be no time really for a myth or for a fabrication to occur. So the earlier you can get to written down documentation of Jesus's resurrection to when you would expect Jesus's resurrection to have occurred, the more confidence that you can have that what's claimed in that document is actually credible. And when you have those documents from multiple independent sources, that also increases the credibility. But even more than just that documentary evidence, there's also cultural evidence that these accounts of Jesus's empty tomb weren't fabricated, because all the Gospels highlight that the first eyewitnesses to Jesus's resurrection wasn't the apostles, it wasn't even men, it was women. And that is significant because at this time, in this culture, a woman's testimony was virtually worthless. It was worthless in a court of law. And as much as we all have a lot of things to say about that, it simply makes the point that if the claims that the gospel writers make were a later fabrication, that Jesus actually rose from the dead when he didn't actually rise from the dead, there's no way that later fabricators would have women as the eyewitnesses, because it would completely undermine the credibility. The only reason why you'd account women as the first eyewitnesses to Jesus' empty tomb was if it actually happened and your motive for writing this stuff down was to simply document the truth. And thirdly, the Jewish authorities even admit themselves that Jesus' tomb was empty, because of course, if Jesus' tomb wasn't empty, then all they would have to do to discredit the rumors that he'd risen was go and open the tomb and show Jesus' dead body. But they create this story that the disciples actually stole the body, which infers that the body wasn't there. So that's the only explanation they can come up with. So that's the second thing. First thing, Jesus actually died. Second thing, the empty tomb. Third thing is the appearances of Jesus after his birth. It wasn't just that belief in Jesus's resurrection was based on the empty tomb or the fact that there was no body. There are multiple accounts of instances where people claim to see and meet with the risen Jesus after his death. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul documents this whole catalog of people, from Peter to James to some of the other apostles to a whole group of people at one particular time. He catalogs these people who physically saw and met with Jesus after his resurrection, and some of them, Paul says when he was writing, are still alive. And he says to his readers, go and talk to them. If you don't believe me, go and talk to them, because they were actually there and they're still alive. Now, you don't do that if you know you're making this stuff up. It would be very easy to dismiss claims of physically seeing Jesus after his resurrection if it was just one isolated individual. People claim to see things all the time as individuals that aren't real. Some cults often get started by one individual claiming to see something and having exclusive knowledge or experience. That's not the way Christianity started. There were multiple appearances with different people, some individuals, some as groups, all occurring in different locations. And these are independently confirmed by the gospel. So it's much harder to explain away. And fourthly and finally, the disciples were resolute in their belief in Jesus' resurrection, and the early church exploded. So again, none of these things in and of themselves absolutely prove that Jesus was resurrected and that he was the Son of God. But these are four facts, four established facts that historians of all kinds of different worldviews take seriously. And the final one being that they absolutely believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and the early church just exploded. And as much as we're all familiar with that, I think we need to take seriously the fact that that wasn't what was expected to happen. I know that we are all familiar with the Easter story, and we're all familiar that the early church got going, but it is really important to remember just how devastated and terrified and demoralized the disciples would have been after seeing Jesus crucified and killed on Good Friday. It absolutely devastated their expectations that he was Messiah. No one in that discipleship cohort was expecting Jesus to rise again, because the Jews had no concept of a Messiah who would be rejected by his own people and crushed by the Romans. They had no concept of a Messiah who could hang on a tree and, in Jewish mindset, be cursed by God and yet still be Messiah. Good Friday for them proved that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. They were not expecting to see Jesus again, and they'd lost all their hope. And if you read the story of the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, it's all about that. And even the resurrection that the Jews did believe in wasn't the kind of resurrection that actually occurred with Jesus. And yet somehow the disciples suddenly and sincerely and absolutely became convinced that Jesus had rose from the dead, and they believed it early. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, this is what I passed on to you. The things that are the most important things, the most fundamental things about Christianity is this: that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He was raised again according to the scriptures. And he appeared to a number of people that I've already mentioned. And a lot of biblical scholars believe that actually with these few verses, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, he was buried, he was raised again. Paul's actually quoting from an early Christian creed that the earliest believers would have shared and maybe spoken out towards each other from within the first few months of Christianity. So again, this is not the idea that for the first 50 years, first 100 years, nobody actually believed that Jesus got resurrected, but then the myth started to accumulate and it began to become influential and all the rest of it. That's just simply not true. The disciples believed this stuff from their earliest days. And many of those, not just the usual suspects, but those who were enemies of Jesus, like the Apostle Paul, those who were skeptical, like Jesus' younger brother James, they also came to believe this. And it was a belief that they were prepared to suffer and to die for. All of the apostles faced martyrdom for their belief in Jesus as the Son of God. And yet they were absolutely prepared to pay that price for the belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. And here's the thing: if they knew it was a lie, if they knew it was a conspiracy, they would never have done so, because liars make really poor martyrs. There's a number of years ago, there's a famous scandal in America with the US president called the Watergate scandal. And there was a guy who was involved called Chuck Colson, who became a believer in prison after the Watergate scandal. He ended up in prison, and he became a Christian in prison precisely because of this reason, that the disciples were prepared to die for their belief in Jesus' resurrection. Because he said this, he said, in Watergate, you had these guys who were holding on to a secret and were holding on to a conspiracy, and under pressure, they couldn't they couldn't hold fast to that lie for 2 weeks. They caved, couldn't even last 2 weeks. And he said the apostles were totally different. They held on to it, all of them held on to it right to the very end, which suggests that they absolutely believed this. So, four pieces of evidence: Jesus truly died. Jesus's tomb was found to be empty. Jesus appeared to multiple people in different contexts after his death, and the disciples came to truly believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, and the early church exploded. Here's the final question: what makes the best sense of all of those pieces of evidence? What theory? Now, we can get into this in the Q&A, because I'm going to stop, but there are a number of different people who've come up with different theories as to how we explain that away. But I think the conclusion, the explanation that best suits the facts, that gives the best explanation, is that Jesus truly rose from the dead. It makes sense of the fact that he died, his tomb was empty, the disciples did actually see him, and they became fully convinced because of that. And we can get into more of it, but I would just encourage you to think, if these things are taken seriously by all kinds of scholars, how do we make sense of it? We have to do a Poirot, we have to do a Miss Marple, we have to do an Inspector Morse, and say, how do we piece all of these things together and come up with a coherent explanation? And I think that the most coherent explanation is that Jesus truly rose from dead. Now, of course, we might say, well, how could that be possible? Because that was a miracle. But of course, if God exists, then there's absolutely no problem for him to do a miracle and raise Jesus from the dead. And that was the Christian claim from the very beginning, that God made Jesus, whom people and um, ourselves crucified. God raised him from the dead, and that proves that he's Lord and that he's Christ, that he's exactly who he says to be: not a liar, not a lunatic, but the Son of God.
Thank you so much, Gareth. That was really helpful, and so much to think about. And if anyone else has any questions, still feel free to add more in, or any questions in general about Christianity or anything that Gareth has said. Just fire them through. Our first one here, Gareth, says, "What does the Bible say about where Jesus went whilst he was dead?" Easy one to start with.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. I mean, there are different theories about it. So, the important thing to say is that honest and sincere Christians disagree on it, and have disagreed over various centuries. So I don't think that this is not an issue that's like, if you take a particular different view, you're not a Christian or anything like that. The Bible's not like crystal clear on it, which is why people hold very, very sincere views. But it also suggests that like it's not absolutely fundamental to what Christianity is about. Some people would say that Jesus descended into hell. That's one. I think that's like one of the creeds, or the Apostles' creeds, or something like that. That Jesus was crucified, he descended into hell, and there's a whole theological movement that basically is called Christus Victor, where Jesus is conquering over death, and there's passages that people can refer to in 1 Peter 3 that talk about Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison and things like that. So some people would say that Jesus descended into hell and kind of conquered the powers of hell and then was raised up. But of course, Jesus said himself to the thief on the cross that on this day, in other words, when they both died, that this criminal would be with him in paradise. And so you gotta sort of wrestle with that. That doesn't suggest that Jesus thought that he was going to sort of descend into hell, but actually there was going to be somewhere else that he would go that would be known as paradise, and the Jews would have an idea of where that was. Not necessarily heaven in the sense of like the new heaven and the new earth that's going to come, but it does suggest that like the presence of God. So yeah, so I mean, there are different views. It's not absolutely fundamental to being a Christian, but it's interesting to explore it. But yeah, I mean, it's good to think about at the same time. But by far the bigger question is whether he did actually rise.
Thank you, Gareth. Our next one says that the Islamic faith also asserts that Jesus ascended to heaven. However, they usually agree he did not die on the cross, but was raised to life like Enoch to God.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm aware of that. I mean, a lot of one of the theories that I sort of just touched on, I didn't go into that, is suggested about Jesus and how you make sense of all these facts without actually saying that Jesus was raised from the dead, is to suggest that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. And so it's yeah, sometimes it's called the Jesus didn't die theory, sometimes it's called the swoon theory. In other words, the idea that Jesus simply fainted on the cross and deceived everyone that he was dead, and then in the coolness of the tomb he was revived and he managed to escape from the tomb and either made his appearances or, as you say, was basically translated directly into heaven. um, the problem with that is one, it really struggles to make sense of the consensus that Jesus would have actually died. I mean, I think we underestimate just how efficient the Romans were at executing people, and even when there was a question about that, the Romans had ways of establishing whether Jesus did die. And there's accounts in the gospel of making sure that Jesus died where they stick a spear basically into his heart. So generally people who died by crucifixion died by asphyxiation. They basically suffocated because they lost the strength to hold themselves up, and the chest cavity closed and they couldn't get it open again. And then over a long period of time they eventually ran out of strength to reopen it, and they just suffocated. If you wanted to quicken things up, you would break people's legs, so that people then couldn't push them up. And if you wanted to really quicken things up, you would stab them in the heart. So the Romans were experts in killing people. And in fact, even if Jesus wasn't killed by the cross, most scholars would agree that actually the level of torture and abuse that Jesus would have received in the scourging would almost have guaranteed that he would have died anyway. So even if he didn't physically die on the cross and was taken down and put into a tomb, his body and organs would have been so traumatized by all of those experiences. Of course, that doesn't absolutely rule out the fact that, maybe by some strange phenomenon he could have survived. But then you've also got the question of, um, well, how did he get out of the tomb? And second of all, you've also got the question of, um, even if Jesus did by some, um, incredible feat manage to survive, that wouldn't have meant that the apostles believed that he was the Son of God or were convinced that he was resurrected. a Jesus who would have survived those experiences would have at best have managed to sort of crawl out of a tomb. It would have taken him months and months of recovery. He would have needed extensive medical help and treatment. It's just not the picture whatsoever that the Bible gives of the Jesus that the apostles encountered, whose body was, in a sense, fully restored, and he wasn't a broken man who'd been through the kind of experiences that Jesus would have been through just days earlier. And so, in that sense, they would have concluded what, as Islamic thinkers and other people who sort of propagate this swing theory would have thought, that actually somehow he didn't die, but he'd still been rejected by the Jewish authorities. They wouldn't have come to the conviction that he was the Son of God who'd been resurrected by the power of God and thereby proved to be Messiah. So yeah, I mean it was a popular theory. It's not that popular anymore because of these other facts that have been established. But again, it doesn't make sense of a lot of the facts. It certainly doesn't make sense of the fact that we're probably about 99.9% sure that Jesus would have died on the cross. It doesn't make sense of the appearances. It doesn't make sense that the disciples were convinced that he was the Son of God and um, were prepared to be crucified themselves and give up their lives for it. So most scholars working in the field don't take that theory seriously anymore, just because it's just so improbable.
Perfect. Thanks, Gareth. This next question is just in two parts. So part one says Jehovah Witnesses believe that Jesus isn't divine as they don't accept the doctrine of Trinity. And then part two is, do you have any advice to how a Christian could go about explaining both the divinity of Jesus and the doctrine of the Trinity to a Jehovah Witness?
Yeah, I mean, there are people on this call who are probably better equipped to do this than me, but like, um, I don't have a lot of experience of speaking to Jehovah's Witnesses, but I would encourage people to apply the same principles as um, as I would with anyone who doesn't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So the fact that they're a Jehovah's Witness in some ways is irrelevant because atheists don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So I would want to establish sort of common ground about what do you believe and why you believe it, in the same way that if I'm talking to an atheist, I would want them to see that they have a worldview as well. Is it coherent? Does it make sense? On what basis do they believe that? Because atheism's not a default position. So I'd want to sit down, I'd want to have a conversation. If we can go to like certain parts of scripture, things like Revelation 1, things like John 1, and particularly passages like John 8, where Jesus claims to be the I am God of the Old Testament. And then just ask some questions, like gentle questions, not combative questions, just open, honest. How do you make sense of this? What does this say? It seems to me like Jesus is clearly identifying himself as the Son of God. It seems to me that this was the very reason why Jesus was crucified in the first place, that the Jewish leaders were so offended at his blasphemy by equating himself to be the Son of God, so much so that the high priest would tear his robes when Jesus said that they would see heaven opened and the Son of Man ascending and descending from heaven and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I just want to rather than just sort of um, create a loads of like spiritual bullets in order to take out somebody who's a Jehovah's Witness. I just want to say, look, um, let's have a good conversation. Learn to ask really good questions. Become convinced in your own mind about why Jesus is the Son of God, and then learn to ask questions about your Jehovah's Witness friend, about why they believe what they believe, and also how they make sense of some of these texts. Because as far as I'm aware, they do take these texts seriously as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Gareth. So next one is um, just outside of the subject of the cross, but it's still a really good question. What do you say to people who say that we are in the end times and that the second coming is near?
Um, again, like I would want to ask questions and just say, on what basis do we think that? The bottom line is, when it comes to the New Testament, that Jesus's focus was very much on us being the right kind of people rather than knowing the particular calendar that God has put in place for these kinds of events. Jesus said that no one knows, not even the Son, only the Father, as to when the end is actually going to come. And the reason why he said, in things like Matthew 24 and all these others, he said to his disciples about these things, there's certain things that are going to happen. There's certain people who are going to claim to be Christ. You'll hear of wars, you'll hear of rumors of wars. The reason why wasn't so that we could then necessarily create a chart and say, oh, this means this, and this means this, and this means that we're only like a couple of years away from Christ's return. It was basically to encourage them to say, nobody knows when this day is going to come, and therefore you have to be ready. Be ready. That was Jesus's emphasis. Be ready for when it does come. Don't like try to work out when it will come, because no one knows. So don't waste your time. Um, the important thing is that it could be at any moment. Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow. Could be in 100 years. Could be in another millennia. But what God is looking for is whenever that moment comes, whether it comes through our death or whether it comes through Christ's return and we don't die. What God is looking for is not people who can identify the day, but who will be living the right way when the day comes, if that makes sense. It's so easy, and I know people, and I've kind of been there myself. Like, because it's mysterious and it's interesting. It can be quite like attractive to get really bogged down into some of this stuff. And there are a lot of people who've written a lot of books and have been almost too successful in their theories about when this is going to come. The problem is they end up being wrong, and so for all the speculation and all the hype, 2 years before the end was meant to come, then you get 2 years down the line, and it's like, what happened there? So we gotta just be careful to get the right things in proportion, and I think God was deliberate in not giving us too much specificity about when this is going to come, because it's like evangelism, like it's I always say to people, if I'm talking about apologetics, 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you give. The same word in the original language for ready, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope, is the exact same word that Jesus uses when he says, be ready, for the Son of Man comes at a day and hour that you don't know. In other words, you don't know when the next evangelistic opportunity is going to come up. So you have to live in a perpetual state of readiness. You also don't know when the Son of Man is going to come. So you have to live in a perpetual state of readiness. And I think that's what God's after.
Thanks so much, Gareth. That's I didn't know that before. um, there's one final question, but if anyone has a question they haven't asked yet and still want to, feel free to add that one in. But this question says, what happened to the Jewish people who died in the gap between Christ on the cross, bringing true salvation, and not hearing of this truth?
Sorry, say again. I missed the middle part of it, Kate.
What happened to the Jewish people who died in the gap between Christ on the cross, bringing true salvation, and not hearing of this truth?
Um, who died in the gap between
Between
Christ?
Christ and the cross, um, and bringing true salvation, and then not hearing of this truth.
Okay, so okay. So basically, like, um, those who died between Good Friday and Easter Sunday.
I
Is
think,
that
I
is
think
that the gig?
I'm not sure, but
I
Good
think, I mean,
call.
I think it's similar to like the question about what about those who didn't believe, or what about those who came before
Mhm,
Jesus, those Jews who existed before Jesus, like what's going to happen to them? Um, and I often hear people say that, like, oh, before like Jesus, it was like, um, that people kept the law and they had like all the Old Testament rituals and things like that, and that's how people were justified and made right. But of course, that's exactly the opposite of what Paul says, where he says, by the works of the law, no flesh, no human being will be justified by purely keeping the works of law, and whether that's before Christ or whether that's after Christ. Um, the the thing that justifies us is faith, and faith in the evidence that we have. So Abraham is the absolute paradigm of faith in God in the Old Testament. He was the original one, and you have that great encounter in the middle of Genesis where God begins to reveal himself to Abraham and begins to make promises to Abraham. And Abraham responds. I think it's Genesis 15 or something like that. Abraham believed God. In other words, he had faith. He believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. In other words, like Abraham believed on the basis of the evidence that he was given. Um, he probably knew nothing about Christ. So he probably knew about a hundredth of what we knew. And yet, based on what he knew, he responded to the evidence that he was given, and God honored it. And I think it's the same with anyone who comes, before Christ on that basis. But it's also the same of those who come after Christ. We're justified on the basis of what we do with the evidence that we are given, whether we believe it or whether we refuse to believe it, for whatever reason. And so I think for those who were kind of in that intermediate period between Good Friday, I think ultimately without faith it's impossible to please God. And and so those who died either in that period or before that period um will be responsible to God for what they have done with the evidence that they were given. Now, that's not to say, got to be careful about this, that they didn't need Christ in order to be saved, because even Abraham will be saved on the basis of what Christ has done, because Abraham was a sinner like everybody else, but he believed on the basis of the evidence that was given. So he'll still be like forgiven. He'll still be in relationship with God. He'll still be in heaven on the basis of what Christ has done. But in terms of his responsibility, he was responsible to respond to the evidence to which he was given, and he did, and God responded to him by justifying him, by counting it as righteousness. And we're the same. But the challenge for us is this: the evidence that we have is far greater, because because we just don't have the testimony of the ancient patriarchs, or we just don't have the testimony of the temple or the tabernacle. The word has become flesh and made its dwelling among us, John says. And so God, right, sort of where I started, God has come into human history and made himself accessible, um, in a way that couldn't be clearer to human beings. So we're not just trusting in people who heard things, remotely or in an isolated place in a cave in the Middle East, and then came down and said, God spoke to me and this, but we can never really know whether that's true. It's a gift that God wrote himself into human history, because, as I said, history is checkable. And um, and because of that, then the real question is, how seriously are we taking that evidence? If we have way more evidence than Abraham had. Jesus once said that to whom much is given, much will be expected. God will hold us responsible on the basis of the evidence that we've given. Not everybody has the same level of evidence, but we have a lot of evidence. Not everybody has the Bible in their language. Not everybody has people who are able to communicate it. Not everybody has the same opportunities and the same upbringing in sort of Northern Ireland that we have had. And as much as that is a privilege, it's also a massive responsibility to say, is my faith responding in proportionate to the tremendous amount of evidence that God in His grace has given me? So I don't know if that fully answers the question. I have a video on this because it's kind of related to the question of um, what about those who've never heard of Jesus? And I have a video of it on the Solus website. So if you go on the Solus website, it's solus-cpc.org, and you'll see a lot of like, well, there'll be a wee tab that has like short answers. And my colleague Andy Bannister, who's my boss, he's got loads of videos, but I've also got some videos and continuing to put more up. And one of them is on what about those who've never heard, and I kind of articulate what I've just said in a much better way than I just have kind of off the top of my head. So check it out if it's at all helpful, because it is an important question.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Gareth. And thanks so much to everyone who put questions in. And this recording is going to be on our YouTube. Isn't that right, team? Yeah, it's going to be on our YouTube. So if you have a friend who wanted to tune in and missed it for some reason, or you want to share this, then that'll be there. And thanks so much, Gareth, for keeping with those questions so well, and thanks so much for your support over the past year. It's very much appreciated.
No, not at all. Thank you. Sorry again that it was so rushed tonight. Like this is a massive like topic, and I have books on my shelf that are like on this topic that are like 700 pages long. So it's huge, but I just want you guys to have confidence that it's not just Christians who take these facts seriously. It's a lot of other scholars as well. Now they don't all draw the conclusions that I've drawn, but in terms of like those established facts, that's there. And I guess the one question I just wanted to throw out is, okay, if these are the pieces of evidence that we know, what do you say is the best explanation? And personally, I'm convinced that the best explanation is that Jesus did rise, and if He did, that changes everything. And Easter's real, not just for bunnies.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to ask further questions, then you can message me, or I don't know, message the Human Stramillis page, and we can pass those questions on. I can try and get an answer for you, or even the Stramillis Christian Union Instagram page. Happy to hear from anyone. I'm just gonna close in prayer, and after this, there's going to be some breakout rooms just for us to catch up and to chat to some people. So feel free to stay on the call and say hello to some people. But feel free to leave if you want to go and get a quick walk in before the sun goes down. But yeah, I'm going to pray quickly here. God, I just thank you so much, Lord, for Gareth and for the wisdom that you've given him, Lord. I thank you for all that he has shared tonight, and I thank you for the truth that Jesus died and rose again. I thank you, Lord, for how much that means to us as Christians, Lord, and the impact that makes on every day, Lord, and how even though it was a long time ago, Lord, it's still so relevant and changes so much for us now, Lord. And I thank you for that. Thank you for all the people on this call, Lord. Pray you be with them. And I thank you so much for them, Lord. And I just pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.